I mean, I've known about some of your work for a while, but what I really enjoyed you talking about was the sort of architecture without a capital A, like the real people making real stuff, and that sort of, how just making stuff simply can be, just really honest, and then come up with something that's like actually really responsive to the place. And I think that's a really great message too.
I think I've been running from architecture for, I guess, most of my life in some ways, in that, capital A architecture it's very kind of formal and rules bound and top down kind of, and I think that it takes itself very seriously, architecture, and I think, I have a love-hate relationship with it in some ways, because I think that architecture generally is a force for good, but it's it's architecture that forgets that it's only architecture if it's connected to the world, the mess of the world, that it becomes interesting. And I think architecture forgets about how interesting the mess of the world is.
Yeah, that's interesting, the mess of the world. I liked India's a very messy place.
India's an incredibly messy place, because
but it's beautiful.
It's so there's a guy called in fact I was just reading about him actually when I was waiting for a guy called Stuart Brown, but also a guy called Richard Sennett, that writes a lot about how those dense cities in India are in a way model communities, because they're incredibly informal, and there's a lot of things that overlap and are intertwined, and they are filled with life. They're not in any way sanitized. Yep. And in this country, most things are pretty sanitized. I mean, in part, I think we're going to talk about housing, in part because of regulations, actually, because it's incredibly difficult to not do anything architecturally, particularly in the context of building houses, which is what we're going to talk about, that isn't in some ways controlled by regulations. I mean, I think the big headline of this is that it's very difficult to get a mortgage for a building that doesn't have building regs. So it's very difficult to get a mortgage for a self-build, and it's very difficult to get planning for a self-build. That's a piece of experimentation that allows you to make things up as you go along. And, usually you have to find another way to do it if you want to self-build. You have to kind of smuggle it past the system somehow.
Get a bit wily with it.
Yeah, which is what I did, I guess, 25 years ago.
Yeah, no, so you built your own house, and then I saw your the trailer that you did for your daughter.
We've done lots of houses for ourselves. I mean, partly because of, if I'm really honest, partly because of economic necessity. It's cheap to do it by yourself. And so we built the original house. We bought the original land because no one else wanted to buy it, because it had no car access. So we had to walk down through this woodland, which for me was an asset. I liked that we had to, park and walk down through this woodland to a piece of land we bought very cheaply in St Catherine's Valley that's north of Bath. So an incredibly beautiful valley that was only affordable to us if we were prepared to compromise by, not being able to drive there. Yeah. But actually at the time, a lot of our friends had, say, places in London on the 6th story of a building, and they had, kids, for example, and they would come home with a baby, not be able to park, and if they had 2 kids, they'd have to leave one in the car, rush up, and, So they had, in fact, a far less practical... Someone's... we can just... doing something on social media. So they had a far less practical kind of, domestic setup than we did. We could park somewhere, walk down through woodland with our kids or babies as they were then, carrying everything in a wheelbarrow, and it was incredibly easy. But it meant that we could buy a piece of land, live in, a really old, run-down building that was there, and then work out how to do a self-build, which was on the side of the existing sort of funny folly that we bought. And we built something for about 85 grand, and we did that through building it ourselves, really, primarily, or working alongside people who were on site full time, and having to do everything, you know, from labouring to, you know, plumbing and electrics through to, you know, whatever else.
Yeah.
And that was really sort of formative, actually, and really
Did you have
empowering.
any building experience, or was it just
A little
coming
bit.
from architecture?
A little bit. I mean, my parents were people that, you know, kind of did things themselves. You know, they didn't, you know, we never got decorators in that kind of stuff. They just would, you know, do things themselves. They were kind of resourceful people.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just how we were, I guess. We didn't really think about it. We just could do things, you know. And I remember when I started going out with someone, and her parents lived in this very kind of neat house. Everything was kind of finished. They had kind of thermostats that controlled things. I was like, God, there was another way of, you know, doing things. I was quite surprised. But it never occurred to me that we kind of couldn't do it, really, you know, build a house, because I guess it's quite elemental in terms of what goes where. And I guess particularly with, you know, my own sort of, I guess, knowledge as an architect, I kind of knew conceptually how things go together. I think what happened, though, was when you are an architect and you have no building experience, everything is kind of idealised, you know, relationships between things. Whereas actually building is quite complex.
Yeah.
And what I started to realise as I built more and more things over the years was that there was a way of working with my kind of amateur cack-handedness that was something that made it a positive rather than a negative. Because typically, you know, if you build something, everything's very neat and controlled and has to fit into that architect world of, you know, precise tolerances.
Yeah.
And I realised there were two things. One, I wasn't really interested in that world of kind of neatness. And second, there was a way of building that allowed me to kind of do things that were looser and more informal, a bit messy, a bit rougher, and still think of it as a, you know, interesting piece of design, really. So, you know, we built the house, and then many years later built the studio for 15 grand, and built a little house for my daughter that now she lives, in fact she got married and, you know, lives in Worcestershire, but you know, we let it out to somebody else, and that was, I can't quite remember how much we built that for, but it wasn't very much. And, you know, and so on and so on, and there's something kind of amazing having had, I guess, the privilege of being able to eke out these little settlements just with what materials we have to hand. Yeah. And none of it has cost very much. I mean, we actually bought the woodland around us with two neighbours about 10 years after we moved there. And again, we bought it for commercial forestry rates, but it meant that we had things like, extended the mortgage to it, but we had things like permitted development rights to be able to build various buildings, which was amazing, because if you can build with the permitted development, you don't need to go through the process of planning in the same way.
Yeah.
You submit a notification of intention to erect a building essential for the purposes of forestry and agriculture, which the studio is, and it's a kind of woodland, you know, office and place for machines and things, as well as, you know, my studio, and so on. And the trailer actually is a movable building. So, you know, and all those things, I guess, are kind of fudged and, you know, smuggled through. But in the conventional world of self-build, with conventional self-build mortgages and land that's inflated, none of that would have been possible. But they have given, you know, I guess all of my family a sense that you can just you can just do stuff, and it's not complex. And when my daughter lived in the trailer, she got together with John, who she's now married to, and John actually is a doctor, but he was experimenting with building things. You know, he built a log shed for them, he built a deck for them, and, you know, various other things with no real construction knowledge. Again, he just, you know, felt that he could, which is great, actually, for me to see that these buildings weren't things that were kind of, you know, things that were finished and architectural. They were just kind of pieces of rural infrastructure, really.
They get used and they evolve. And
Exactly.
I think when you build your own house,
Exactly.
It really, you just build what you need in that moment. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not just a house; it's a home.
But I think we want so much as well. I mean, I think Ims and John were really happy living in the trailer. You know, it's a little place. It's kind of 35 square metres or something, and that was enough. You know, that was enough. And I think that, you know, I can't remember whether it was about 30 grand or something, but actually, you know, there's a sense that we need so much. You know, so much stuff, so much this, so much that. And in a way, there is a way to build that's kind of quite modest and just uses what we have around us to build enough space that in theory can be extended and changed and adapted. But it doesn't need to be this kind of permanent thing of building a kind of, you were talking earlier about the kind of grand design's dream. It isn't that at all. I mean, that's kind of land hungry and expensive and not necessarily great use of resources, whether it's land or material or money. And there is another way, I think.
Yeah. And I really like your projects where you use the timber from the site and sort of did like what's called hewing the thing.
Yeah, that's again just come from just using what's around us, actually. I mean, I think, when I started, I didn't really know how to use timber. The house uses timber in a really naive way originally because it kind of shrank and it was bolted together and those kind of things. But over time, I got much better at understanding how to use timber. And I had fantastic neighbours, a guy called Charlie Brentnell, who died tragically last year. But he was a kind of ceramicist turned maker turned timber, carpenter, fabricator, whatever. And he had an incredible wisdom with, timber, really. And working with him kind of unlocked a way of seeing a resource. But also, we were just surrounded by it. And I think, the studio, for example, is a building that just used the trees that were on the site. And that was a point of principle in that, we only had that much stuff. We only had that much money. We only had that much stuff in terms of the material resources. And those trees were going to come out anyway because they were larch trees in a deciduous woodland. And, I can't remember, there's 8 trees or whatever it was. But it was like that was the resource. So that defined how much we could build. And we did the least amount of milling just to make it something that could be constructed and to make the material go furthest. And then we kind of scavenged everything else. And that material has a kind of provenance with where it's from and also the skills and resources that were used to make it, which were, again, people who just lived locally, who were my neighbours and friends, that didn't know about making, but they weren't makers and builders with capital M's and capital B's. They just were people who lived in rural places that kind of could do stuff, And for me, that's one of my favourite projects, is the studio, in fact, because of that way that what I see when I look at it or I'm in it is all of the thinking in the hands of the people that did it. And I see the lack of skill, but the lack of skill doesn't make the building worse. For me, it makes it kind of better because it allows them to take part.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the people that build the houses impart their story into it, I think.
Yeah. And I think a project like that is an opportunity to have lots of conversations with people. And if you can see the fruits of those conversations, they get really, really interesting, actually.
Yeah. No, I mean, I learnt so much more from 6 months of building a house than I did studying architecture. I think it's absorbing knowledge through your hands is much easier than...
Because it's not idealised as well, is it? The sense of architecture is that everything's idealised. Even a brick or a piece of timber is kind of idealised, or even a person and what a person can do and how they'll do it is sort of idealised. And I also think that if you work with people, you leave the conversation open to doing things differently, and not just in the way that you can preconceive. And however interesting your imagination is, I don't think it's as interesting as the conversations that emerge through the kind of collective endeavour of doing something.
Yeah. I liked what you said as well during your talk about the sort of choreography of a build and the sort of temporary structure. And because it's not about the finished product, it's about the process of
completely building. It is, and there's a kind of beauty in that, in the mindset of how does this thing come together is really, really interesting. And I think a lot of what architecture does at best actually is to think through how am I going to put this thing, assemble this thing. And part of learning about making things, I think, when you're at uni or when you're an architecture student, is really about thinking how can the process of making something inform what I ultimately do and how I do it. And it isn't, again, this idealised thing that we draw in abstract and give to somebody else to build. We've kind of built it in our head before we involve other people sometimes when it's at its most formal and we have to build things, with regulations and everything else. But even when we don't, I think allowing ourselves to be open to the knowledge of others is really, really interesting and a much more fruitful conversation than cutting ourselves off. And architecture actually is quite good at cutting ourselves off from the knowledge of others. And actually, in the context of building your house, there's something, I think, that I would argue the most greatest proportion of the population are disempowered in that actually they can't make many decisions around their houses because either they feel they don't have the skills, or they can't navigate the regulations, or there isn't the system that allows them to do it, whatever. But in many other parts of the world, people can build informally with what they have in a way that we've done in our woodland,
Yeah. No, I think, the restrictions in the UK are so, restrictive. I think the joy of travelling, especially in Asia, is just like, every house is self-built and doesn't. I was amazed. I saw this set of concrete steps that at the thinnest point it was like this thin, and it was standing, and you couldn't build that here because it's so strict. But
yeah. I mean, again, I love Southern Europe where most of the villages are. I mean, I guess it's kind of cliche to like those villages, but none of them have been built with architects. They're all just buildings that have evolved over many years using what's around in a very informal way. But the act of the places that are made, the place making that happens through that kind of informal, just doing what works and embracing the kind of accidents. They're the most successful villages in the world in some ways, in terms of the kind of interstitial spaces that really work and are informal and have shared sort of or people don't really know who owns them. They're just places that work around, collective dwellings.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that it is in the UK as well. Like all of our villages and towns, that's how everything's always been built. But I don't know when it happened, but at some point we decided we needed loads of rules.
1948 was the Planning Act.
Okay, there you go. That's when it happened.
I mean, in some ways, you could argue that some rules, I think, are probably important because, in that, I guess I'm a big kind of believer in wilderness and open spaces, and I think that building in settlements and sharing resources is generally a good thing. But I think that, after that, in theory, there should be far fewer rules, and I can't remember the other night when I talked about Almere in Holland, that is, in a way, the best self-built community that is in the world in some ways, the best planned self-built community, because the bits that were put in place were the kind of infrastructure, the roads and the parks and the schools and the kind of other buildings. And then there were a kind of very simple set of rules, which meant you had to meet the road, you had to meet your neighbour, and that was it. You could then build anything. And because of that system, and then the land value was capped, and you could buy land with a passport to build, and there's finance available, because it's Holland. But actually, there were kind of crazy self-built experiments, and also kind of very considered things by architects right next to one another. But as a whole, the place was incredibly successful, because of the infrastructure, the simple infrastructure that was provided. And we've talked our email about Quinta Monroy, and what's amazing about Quinta Monroy is that there's a simple bit of infrastructure that's about as simple as it can be, and then anyone can do anything in those spaces, and that's kind of what Almere is. And I think the things that are built are incredibly beautiful. And actually, we were talking about it here the other day when we were talking about Patrick Schumacher, who was Zaha Hadid's business partner, was highly critical of that scheme winning the Sterling Prize, because he said it's just a piece of humanitarian work. And I was arguing that even if it is rather a piece of humanitarian work or a piece of sociology, actually, if you just look at what's there, it's some of the most beautiful bits of built infrastructure I've ever seen. Genuinely, you can judge it on its aesthetics, and it's amazing. It's an amazingly beautiful set of spaces and places with very kind of human sort of values and relationships. And Patrick Schumacher just can't see that.
Yeah, it's not neat and lined up and I mean, there's a kind of in a way I would argue that the way architects make buildings is so kind of obvious. Everything is lined up. There are very few architects that don't have a sock drawer where everything is just shades of grey and lining things up. And I think that much of architecture is lining things up with a grid or controlling or setting it out. If you're not an architect, you have no concern for it. So if you look at the studio, the studs are all over the place, and it doesn't matter. No, it holds itself up. I really think that once you have learnt the rules, your creativity just suddenly drops off, because you've put yourself in this little box. And I think breaking rules is when the interesting stuff happens. And people that don't know the rules are the best people to break them, because they don't even know that they're doing something wrong.
And actually, at best, architectural education is interesting because, you know, one of the criticisms is that you don't know what to do with a brick. But actually, what I quite like is that if you give an architecture student a brick, they think, God, this thing is amazing. You know, what can I do with it? They have no sense that it's supposed to be, you know, whatever it is. And you can invent stuff. And, you know, there are fantastic build programs elsewhere in the world, like Rural Studio in Alabama, in America, in the southern states, that build. I mean, ultimately they build because land's cheap. You know, there's a rural, poor black population that own land, and that's unusual. But they're land rich in some ways. They have pieces of land, but they don't have any money. You know, and this program at Auburn, Alabama, set up by a guy called Sam Mockbee, encouraged architecture students to come spend a year there and build just with what, you know, they had or could scavenge or whatever it was. And those buildings again are incredible because, you know, they're quite anarchic experiments. They're using just what they can get and scavenge. They're a kind of new vernacular. You know, they use car windscreens and they use shredded wax cardboard and they use, you know, broken, you know, concrete blocks that are destined for landfill and, you know, all sorts of other things that you can't typically use or don't typically use. And then, you know, they're lots of people's thinking that come together. They're quite kind of anarchic. They're not single kind of, you know, ideas. And they're incredibly successful pieces of architecture as well, I would say. If you just judge what you can see, regardless of what they do from a kind of humanitarian perspective. You know, so it's just a completely different sort of way of making things that is very difficult to do again within capital A architecture, where we learn to do things by ourselves, we learn to justify things by ourselves, divorced from the kind of, you know, the joy of the world. You know?
No, I really struggled with that at uni, having to do projects by myself, and it just seemed so bonkers because you never do a project by yourself ever in real life. Ever, and like, you know, you learn so much from other people, and it's like it's such a great opportunity to connect with other people and get your ideas questioned and not just like run with something because you think.
But also materials, you know, you also work with what you have, you know, and actually at architecture school you don't do that. You build in an abstract way, and then at the end of it you work out what to make it from. Whereas, you know, in the world of just simple self-built experiments, you know, there's a kind of material hinterland that just gives you, you know, a context to work in. You know, what have we got? What can we use? What can we get? And that, you know, starts the conversation. And actually, we're building a thing here for students, the Architectural Educators Conference, and actually, you know, there's no money. And so one of the things is to say, well, what can we build if we don't have anything? Well, and there is stuff, you know, there's waste, all this stuff is kind of, you know, cut by the grounds people. There's stuff that we can begin to accrue that will allow us to make space. And I think it's much better to have no money in this context of, you know, students sort of experiments, rather than, oh, there's a budget of £5,000, you know, you can go and buy some timber and then, you know, work out what's an idealised kind of form, which actually that is, you know, you could argue it's just a kind of space. It's, you know, it's kind of fine, but it doesn't have a relationship with this place in a way that just using what we have could give you.
Yeah, I think one of the joys of building a house in a bit of land that you love is making it respond to the place. And I was talking to the guys at Material Cultures, and they do a lot of research about looking at the wider landscape around the area and looking at sort of like where the material could come from, and thinking about changing agricultural waste into stuff. And
they did an amazing piece of research in the West Midlands actually, which looked at that hinterland, and actually so that's what we ask our students here in my unit here, which is, you know, sort of semi-rural on the edge of a, you know, small town, real site, and they are looking at what is the physical territory, you know, where do you get stuff from, and how do you make decisions about whether it's here or there, you know, and actually what is the kind of hinterland, what's the radius, you know, how do I know how to use something, you know, is it 2 miles, 5 miles, 100 miles, or is it just, does it vary depending on, you know, what's available, how you get it there, you know, where it's come from, what its carbon footprint is, all those kind of things. And that's a really interesting piece of research that takes quite a lot of time initially to work out, but once you've got that, it really informs your thinking. You know, you don't just end up with kind of abstract stuff that's plonked down, made out of, you know, stuff you can get at Travers Perkins.
When you talked during the talk, when you talked about your place in Greece made of concrete and steel, like my initial reaction to it, so when I was at uni we weren't allowed to use any concrete in our designs, which I think they might have changed now, but no concrete and steel, so I was like, what? That's terrible. And then you completely just myth busted that one for me.
Well, yeah, it's a really hard one, that one. So again, built our own place there very cheaply, and sounds like we built loads of things, but actually, you know, I'm quite old and been doing this a long time, and that was really cheap. And that is a place that, you know, I'm an outsider, and there's a culture of making things that people who live right there, that I've known for a long time, work with. You know, they have formwork they use again and again and again and again and again. They have aggregate they get from just down the road. You know, there's a set of stuff that they know how to do that actually is incredibly resourceful in, you know, there's no scaffolding, they don't use scaffolding, there's no kind of, you know, whatever it is. And there was an opportunity to use a material that actually technically is carbon hungry, although kilo for kilo it's very low actually relatively. If you look at the kind of table compared to aluminium, glass and steel and all those other things, you know, it's quite, but it's the amount you use, you know, I know all that. But it has no plastic, no insulation, it has no membranes, it has no heating, no cooling, it has no stuff. You know, there's none of the extraneous stuff, which means that in a place that there is no timber, it's an earthquake zone, it's a fire zone, all those kind of things. That's where we spent our kind of carbon hit. And, you know, as I said in the talk, I did do a calculation. If I built a passive house with a timber frame with imported timber, passive house with you know, triple glazing, incredibly carbon hungry, membranes, MVHR, you know, all the rest of it on a concrete slab, that would be higher in carbon than our building, you know, in terms of its lifespan, way higher. And so it isn't ideal. And I think part of in this conversation about sustainability, it's really, really hard to make decisions around what we do, because nothing's ideal. You know, in here, you know, when I live in Bath, as I alluded to in the talk, it's, you know, it's land hungry, it's away from, you know, a town or a city, it's, you know, we have to get food delivered, you know, there's a kind of supermarket that comes, whatever it is, once a week, and, you know, the kids have had to go in a car to school and have had to drive to get here. But, you know, the house is effectively off-grid, you know, photovoltaics, battery backup, timber frame, you know, all that stuff, grow our own food, all, you know, a lot of our own food, all that kind of stuff. But it's still, if we look at what's sustainable, it actually isn't, because sustainable means everyone can do it, and you can repeat it. There isn't enough space and to allow us to do that. And also, you know, the problem also is in rural places, you know, even the road, the asphalt in the road and the pipes and all the other infrastructure is more intensive from a kind of carbon perspective than living in a city where you share all that stuff. You know, the city grows from 100,000 to 200,000. The amount of resources you need doesn't double, it kind of goes up by 3/5, you know, whatever it is. So living together just makes sense. So if we go back to this, you know, trying to justify this place in Greece, and actually, you know, in a way I kind of, whatever I build I can't, you know, I do drive there sometimes go on the train, and, you know, sometimes we fly. I can't justify it. But, you know, from a kind of perspective of really, you know, wanting to be in that landscape, wanting to do something that builds on the set of relationships and networks that people, you know, understand locally, it does make sense. And, you know, the steel, actually, for what it's worth, because you mentioned the steel, is rebar. That's that thick. It's the most lightweight I can possibly make a truss. You know, and again, I haven't done the calc, but if I did do the calc based on imported treated timber from Scandinavia, compared to something that's made down the road, I suspect it's probably lighter in carbon. But, you know, they're all existentially incredibly complex decisions, and I'm not ever suggesting that architecture can solve things.
You know, environmental sustainability is really, really important, but also, if we want to have a sustainable future, it has to be socially and economically
of course,
sustainable for everyone. And you know, your place in Greece that used the skills and the what was right there, and then it becomes responsive to the place
and the people. I mean, culturally, they understand that, you know, there's a kind of network of skills and resources that just makes sense. It is a kind of vernacular building in that sense, and does actually use resources quite minimally, you know, in terms of, you know, ultimately in terms of embodied energy and operational energy. I mean, operational energy is kind of zero, you know, over however long. So, you know, it's always hard. And the other thing, of course, is financial. If I'd used other materials, it was a very, very cheap building. If I'd used other materials, it would have been, you know, much more expensive. Again,
I think that's my one of my issues with like passive house stuff is it just gets slapped on as like this is a fix-all situation, and it's like
no,
it's not.
No. I mean, Field and Clegg, Bradley,
great,
they did some up the road, passive houses,
and
they're incredibly low in use energy because everyone has to drive to get there. You know, and actually, you know, Stuart Brand would argue you want to live in an air-conditioned apartment in New York and walk everywhere. That's actually, and because actually the cost of the is minimal. And his point is the most environmentally benign building in the world is an apartment block that's been built many years ago and it's going to stay there for many years, and it's very dense and you share all this stuff with other people, you walk everywhere. You know, but actually, you know, his point also is, and it's a really interesting one, and it's very difficult for people who are used to this sense that a green building is one in open countryside. He thinks that the greenest thing we can do is to live in a city, because actually this is really a developing world. What happens is that you free up the land from a kind of subsistence farming, you know, scratching around, depleting the land. You allow it to become rewilded by moving, you know, to a place that you share resources, and then you live incredibly economically. But the problem is the cities that we have are not cities that we want to be in typically, because they are polluted, they are noisy, they are dirty, they don't have great green spaces, they don't have great ways of sharing resources and living in a way that does connect you to the natural world, you know. So it's a really difficult one actually, and I feel, you know, I do feel incredibly privileged by having our place here, you know, north of Bath, that is in a woodland on the edge of a valley, surrounded by green stuff, where we can pick wild garlic and not hear a car. And, you know, we can still walk into town and all that kind of stuff. It is an amazing privilege, actually, to have that. And I don't take any of that for granted, actually.
Yeah. No, I've just moved to Bristol, and it's interesting when you're a country person to get used to the city and the noise. But
I think the new thing about rural places, and I was talking to a kind of transport guy here the other day, you know, villages are an amazing model of community, and you know, our local village is like the model community. And you know, and I do cycle, but for most people who don't cycle, actually got to get in your car to go to the next village. Whereas actually, you know, Sarah Featherstone is doing an interesting piece of work called Velo City that is joining up rural villages, you know, to share resources, joining them up by introducing cycle networks, you know, between them. So you can, you know, 3 villages are better than 1 village, and 3 villages actually that are separate but have good networks between them and might share growing spaces. So that's a really interesting way to live, actually.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think there's a guy, he runs a community land trust in Cornwall, and called Amboss, and he's, rather than using the term like co-housing, which I think people don't tend to really understand actually what you mean by that, he's starting to call them like micro villages instead, because villages are how we've always sort of formed around. You know, there was always a central thing that there was a reason people started living there. And
the students here, second years, they've just done a competition, the Davison Prize, with them for a land trust in Watchet. And you know, their first question was, so what are we going to share? You know, what is the stuff that we share? And that's all about the growing and the working and the sharing of other responsibilities. And then in a way, the houses are quite easily, because they support that. They're not these individual kind of silos where we do all this stuff together. And really, you know, we need to be living collectively, living together, even if we have our own spaces within that. And the best housing schemes have that. You know, they are places that have a responsibility to do something other than just make shelter for the people that live in them, you know.
Yeah, no, I think part of where we've gone wrong is where we have like housing over here, and then where we work over here, and then our kids get at school over here, and then our food comes from over here, and none of it's connected, and we don't have any say over it. So if we can build communities where it sort of mixes everything back together, that would be my ideal future.
I think it'd be everyone's ideal future. I'm probably going to have to think about finding students and telling people I'm here and stuff. And
do you have to go and hand collect them?
Well, actually, curiously, today I teach second years, and they have a real. I mean, my master students on Thursday are all there, like waiting. Second years, you have to kind of coax. But actually, I don't run the studio. I support them, and there's usually a briefing thing. But so I just want to say, is there anything else that you want to kind of cover? Do you think?
I did write a bunch of stuff down, but I've totally forgot what all of it was.
Interests me that how do you think what you're doing, which sounds just from having listened to the conversation, how do you think you could help sort of influence planning to be a little
Yeah.
bit more open, so that they can open it up for more people? Because it's all very, you guys with the knowledge are thinking this.
Yeah.
How can that be pushed into the system? That'd be a really nice sort of.
Yeah.
That's a good question, actually. Do you want to ask that? Because otherwise...
Please do.
Okay.
I'll cut it. Just.
Yeah. Okay. So having talked about all of this sort of what we would really love for the future, how do you think we could change the strictness, the rules, and the planning that we have to face it, but
I think that is the $64 million question, and I think at best the planning system is something that can work. If I think back to some of the experiments we did at Hook Park, which was a place I talked about the other night, that is a rural campus for the Architectural Association in Dorset, and planning was given in an outline sense for a new campus, and some of the conditions were that it was explicitly experimental and it used timber from the site in the knowledge that students were going to build stuff. And they have been incredibly supportive, and I think why that works there is that it's an outline consent that you then know you can. So you know you can do it. We know we can build these houses, but then you submit reserve matters application for the kind of detail.
Yeah.
So there's no risk there. So planning, you need to take away risk from planning, and ultimately I think the best way to do that is to get together. So community land trusts, I think, are fantastic things, because not only socially, because the economic model is controlled and the kind of social model is controlled and all that kind of stuff, but actually they can build an argument that in principle this is what we're going to do, and get the local authority on board, and then people can fill in the gaps between that. And individuals then don't carry the risk, because the big picture, this is an experimental community, but actually it's good for these reasons, and you can trust us for these reasons, and actually you don't need to micromanage the colours of the windows, the positions of the windows, and the colours of the downpipes, and all those kind of things. So there's kind of strength in numbers ultimately. I mean, that's the big message, that it's much better to get together with people and build an argument. And there are places in Frome where we were the other night, there's a new self-build or new housing community on a really big scale that's been initiated by that place. So that place,
Mayday, Saxon.
yeah, exactly. And there are other places that are emerging like that, where individuals and locals get together to build an argument for something and ultimately lobby local authorities to support them in the making of those places, because it's what they want. So then, the big picture is kind of understood. What's the social mix? What's the kind of, sustainability agenda? Where are the roads, the infrastructure? But then, most of the other things are kind of devolved down to, people that are just doing it. So, strength in numbers, ultimately.
Strength in numbers and creating a sort of narrative.
Yeah,
a
the
compelling
narrative is
story,
really
I think.
important.
Yeah.
Really important is the
Pull on
narrative.
people's heartstrings a little bit.
Yeah. Always.
Yeah. Cool. Well,
Good.
thank you for chatting with me. It's been
Thanks for
great.
coming. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Your students are very lucky.
Well, I think not. I mean, I learned from them.
Yeah.
So, and I think it is a privilege to teach. Actually, I think as I get older, I felt that I'd done so much of the stuff I wanted to do in practice, that actually universities are really amazing places, because actually you can spend all day talking about interesting things
Ideas.
with interesting people.
Yeah. Yeah, and not get bogged down in planning and
exactly.
building regulations.
Exactly.
It's like, let's have big ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.